I'm Shekhar Shah, the head of NCEAR, and I'm delighted to welcome the panel, Dr. Reddy, former governor of the Reserve Bank of India, chair of the 14th Finance Commission, read all over the macro and monetary policy experience and history of India. He's also a Padma Vibhushan, and so recognized at the highest levels of civilian awards in our country. Dr. Shankaracharya is honorary professor at NCEAR, a great friend of ours, a great friend of NCEAR, and of course very much into the macro issues that confront us. He's held a number of positions in the government of India as economic advisor, as chief economic advisor, and has obviously influenced a great deal of the thinking, including in his position as a member of the Finance Commission. T.L. Nandan is chair of Business Standard, established editor of almost every important journal that we can think of, and somebody who keeps a close eye, and also a very unbiased mind and speaks freely about his thoughts, which is great to have. And then our own Shrita Mandu, who's now a distinguished professor at NCEAR. We are delighted to have him join us in recent months. He's already making an impact on our macro work. So, ladies and gentlemen, please give them a warm hand of welcome. I'm going to start with Reddy, who has kindly agreed to go first, and request him for his opening.
Dr. Jalan, Guruji and friends, it's a privilege and an honor to be here. But honestly, I really look forward to active participation from the younger generation in these discussions. Many of us have been closely involved in the 89, 90, 91 period. So therefore, that shadow may be there in our thinking now, whereas you will be capable of thinking in a new manner. So I suppose I really look forward to learning from the questions and discussions from the younger generation. My presentation is divided into three parts. In the first part, I cover the current macroeconomic environment. In the second part, I identify the policy actions required immediately to address the vulnerabilities and weaknesses on each one of these areas. In the third part, I cover some fundamental issues. There are three aspects of the current situation that we should recognize. First, global conditions. Second, domestic political system stability and regime stability. And three, the domestic economic conditions. I think these are the three important things when we look at our macroeconomic situation. Now, what are the global conditions like? Global conditions are characterized by fear of recession, US-China trade war, conflict in the Middle East / Iran, with the potential impact on oil and capital flows. Oil prices and capital flows, most critical for our economy. Current account deficit is already about 2%. The composition of the external liabilities, if you see now, there is a fairly heavy concentration of short-term debt, heavy concentration of debt paper, and pretty heavy concentration of government paper being held by non-residents. I think that is global asset liability composition. That's what we have to see. As a percentage of foreign external liabilities in the composition, our reserves are not as comfortable as they were some time back. Most important, when the RBI undertakes swap of I think $3 billion or something like that, I think that is in a sense extraordinary financing. So I think that's a signal that behind the normalcy there is extraordinary financing also. Now, domestic system. In India, we have the benefit of domestic political system stability. Even 89, 90, 91, the system stability was there. Therefore, things went through. That's a strong point. Now we have not only political system stability, we have regime stability. And therefore the capacity of the government to handle shocks is perhaps more. I'm not talking of ability, capacity, in the sense it has inherent strengths. So I think that should give us a lot of confidence. But then let's come to the domestic economy. I think slowdown in growth is admitted, but the issue is whether it is cyclical or structural. Perhaps it's a question of mix of cyclical and structural, and that is the most important assessment we have to make in considering the corrective action. There is enough evidence of stagnant potential output in India for almost a decade. There is no evidence of increase on total factor productivity in the recent years. The level of household financial savings has come down significantly, though more recently it is looking up marginally. The government savings revenue deficit is higher. Now, if you look at the balance sheets of the different components of the economy, I believe we have to look at balance sheets also apart from flows. The general government is in deficit. Monetization of government deficit by RBI is perhaps one of the largest in history, in the recent history since 1990. Of course, it is not direct monetization, but indirect monetization. Now, if you look at the composition of the financial sector, banks, the worst is behind, but I think the credit is yet to pick up. They are yet to get into full act together. The non-banking financial companies, at least, and still banks are a little choked in terms of credit growth. The non-banking financial companies, at least some of them, they think they have liquidity problem, but some others think they have solvency problem. But I think that has to be resolved. And then the corporate sector exposure to external debt is rather high. Large corporates have large external debt exposure and therefore vulnerable to external shocks. And the households actually may be having more debt than before, 10, 20 years ago. So if household is more leveraged, the financial savings are less, the corporate exposure to external debt is high, the government sector is leveraged, I suppose. So now you have if some balance sheets are strong and some balance sheets are not so leveraged, are more leveraged, policy maneuverability is more. For instance, if the financial sector is weak, if the fiscal is strong, then it's possible to handle it. But if the both fiscal and financial balance sheets are weak, then policy maneuverability is less. Now let us see, and also the relationship between the balance sheets, and I argue that the financial sector and government sector are so interwoven that all this ultimately go to the government sector increasingly, and that I'll come to later. Now let us look at the policy headroom, fiscal policy headroom. The true fiscal deficit in the current year is perhaps more than in the past. Basically, there is a bit of fudgeting, but the degree of fudgeting, if it is more than what I call the distance between the true fiscal deficit and the visible fiscal deficit. So that is one issue compared to the past. Public sector borrowing requirements seem to be larger than before, for whatever anecdotal evidence we have. But then how is the fiscal deficit sustainable? The fiscal deficit is obviously sustainable with the continuation of financial repression, with the monetization of deficit by RBI, and the non-residents holding more government paper than before, FIIs in particular. The scope for fiscal stimulus should be assessed with reference to the possibility of crowding out effect relative to crowding in effects, in addition to the implications for the medium-term fiscal consolidation path. If we agree that fiscal consolidation is required, then we have to recognize that the headroom is less immediately, though unless we have some special strategies. In regard to monetary policy, this is constrained by the transmission mechanism, which is very evident. The interest rates are relatively low already for savers, though for the borrowers they are high, which is a reflection of the cost of intermediation in the financial system. The link between monetary policy instruments and inflation is suspect because of the weight of food and fuel and the role of fisc in the prices of food and fuel. The administered interest rates is another aspect. So I think one has to recognize the inherent limitations of the monetary policy in a situation like this. With regard to the financial sector regulation, the state of financial sector has large fiscal implications. For one, large entities are government owned. The non-banking financial companies are facing solvency problems, and in fact they are exposed quite a bit to infrastructure and real estate. To the extent they are related to infrastructure, the government gets in. The concentration of many risks in the financial sector reverting to the government are very high. The chances of the risk reverting to the government are very high. Finally, as regards to the external sector, we are comfortable, but the issue is whether we have adequate resilience in the face of possible shocks. Basically, we only have two instruments: capital account management and the exchange rate. Not much of an instrument, but that's all we have. Safety net available from the IMF may not be enough, assuming that they'll be willing to support us and will be willing to put up with the conditionality. But it is possible to say that we may not have a crisis, but it can be having a huge depression effect on the economic activity rather than a crisis. Now let us see, given this situation, of course this is subject to correction, very broad generalizations, what are the possible policy actions? See, there is widespread demand for fiscal stimulus. First, tax concessions. I think first principle is that whatever you do, it should be reversible, that it's not stimulus. Stimulus should be withdrawal. It's not permanent, then it becomes structural deterioration when we are going through a fiscal consolidation. So therefore, tax concessions, I'm not sure whether they are, and more important, when we give a tax concession, we are assuming certain responses from those who benefit from tax concessions. So between taxes and expenditure, my own belief is that expenditure can be more targeted rather than tax concessions. And in the expenditure, again, recurring expenditure instruments are always dangerous because they're not easy to terminate. So it has to be time-bound, limited to the context. But there is one possibility we in the 14th Financial Committee pointed out, that public enterprises are very low leverage. They depend heavily from equity from the government rather than debt. So that the return appears attractive. Actually, the best thing for the government to do, instead of taking the money from the enterprises to fill up the fiscal deficit, they should really encourage enterprises, assess their leverage, and drive them towards leverage. And they should have necessary flexibility, large presence. So in my view, the stimulus can be significantly through central public enterprises. Further, usually we find arguments that stimulus should be through infrastructure or capital expenditure. Infrastructure, there should be a design, then there is a gestation period, and there is a long-term commitment and huge commitment. So one has to be careful in saying that stimulus will be useful if you spend on infrastructure. So actually what we have to see is only those which are starved of funds. That is debottlenecking, where the last mile, 10% to be covered. So you must have criteria for investing in those activities where there is already investment taking place, there is no need for time to be lost. So you require a special mechanism, special fund from the fiscal side. So that's the way I think we should have to go about. This requires perhaps a more special fund than. So in other words, the stimulus can be through a special fund, through a mechanism of acceleration and debottlenecking, rather than generalized stimulus, particularly after we had the experience a few years ago. In brief, the strategy should be to stimulate in a fiscally sustainable manner. Now we come to monetary policy. Monetary policy may have to recognize the contextual importance of flexibility in inflation targeting. Critical decision to be taken is whether monetary policy should add to fiscal stimulus at this juncture or should hold back its reins and use it when it is required. Given the current fiscal condition, I think the choice is fairly clear, but still that is a matter of that it goes beyond the inflation targeting issue. But this is a period which requires thinking of monetary policy beyond inflation targeting. So we have to emphasize more of flexibility in the inflation targeting of the monetary policy. Financial sector regulation has to recognize the problems of choked credit flow in banking, liquidity cum solvency problems of non-banking financial companies, and distressed mutual funds. Each one, there is an origin of the problem. In mutual funds, they are all sponsored by corporates or banks. They receive large funds from them, and they also invest in them. It is not something where the retail investors and households will go voluntarily. They will go only if they are afraid of the banks, I suppose, or tax concessions. Anyway, that's a broader issue, but at the moment the fact remains that there is some distress, particularly at the debt paper. Then of course the debt market is another thing where we are very unique. I think 90% is not traded at all. So I think there are two things that we have to do in regard to the financial sector. You again, like debottlenecking, you have to handle the problem through some mechanisms, immediate problem, rather than say that now what you do, maybe in non-banking financial companies, you have to make a distinction between the 2 or 3 large non-retail deposit-taking NBFCs. I think retail deposit-taking NBFCs are maybe affected by sentiment rather than by solvency issues. So I think some assessment of various categories of NBFCs so that the sentiment does not spread to all types of NBFCs. In regard to the external sector, I think effort should be to restrict short-term credit. This will reduce the vulnerability. This may also enable a more realistic exchange rate. My own preference, and I have expressed it some time back also, that we should aim for zero current account deficit in the normal course, and so that only when there are shocks we go to 2% rather than average of 2%. It should be a ceiling. In brief, de-risking, I would say, given the global uncertainties, I would say the de-risking should be the short-term objective and the long-term strategy also for management of external sector. Now let me mention reform priorities. I think a lot has been said about reforms, but my submission is that priority should be to enhance savings, improve productivity, and ensure conducive investment. I don't think the interest rate changes by 0.25, 0.5 here and there is likely to promote investment or investment demand. There are more things that determine that. There are 3 important areas I believe I would particularly, not that these are the most important, but I believe these are somewhat neglected, which have what I call, which affect more than one policy: fiscal, energy. If you see the energy, we depend on imported energy. Its prices affect our external sector. Energy, that it's a huge source of revenue for both Government of India and for the state governments. In many state governments, I think 40% of the revenue comes from tax on petroleum. And on the expenditure side, it is heavily subsidized at the state level. So I think energy affects fisc financial, banking system, their exposure is large. All the special bonds are really meant to relieve the banks of their exposure to this sector. So I think there should be a cross-sectoral, a cross-policy type of analysis of energy. The second is the link between the government and the financial enterprises, in particular financial enterprises. The link between the government and the rest of the linkages between the two, their inefficiencies and the burden on the economy as a whole, they remain unassessed. For effective reform, these have to be analyzed. In brief, we need inclusive fiscal sector and efficient financial sector, and respective roles clearly defined. The problem is that both try to do, and there is not as much transparency as one would have liked. For 20 years in the reform period, we are trying to make the transactions within the Hindu undivided family, joint family, little more clearer. Now one suspects those borders are getting blurred. So therefore, analytically and also from a policy point of view, I think it is better to account for the relationships, or account better the relationship between the financial and fiscal sectors. Thank you very much.